This happened to me last fall. I live in a city where walking at night is totally fine. However, I still think about this anytime I leave a bar. It was a Friday night. We were at a bar that's kind of tucked into a side street. Dim lighting, loud music, sticky floors. The usual. Just the kind of place where you end up yelling mid-sentence because the music is too loud and have to repeat yourself multiple times. I was out with other friends. We'd been there for hours. Not blackout drunk or anything, but that level where everything feels warmer and funnier than it should. At around 1:30 a.m., everyone started getting one more drink because it was last call. We decided to leave after our last drink as it was closer to 2:15 a.m. Bars in my area kick people out pretty quickly at the end. Lights on, music off, security's suddenly very serious. So we all went out onto the sidewalk with a bunch of other people. We were laughing too loud trying to figure out who was getting an Uber and who was walking home. Two of my friends lived the other direction and got a ride. My friend Veronica lived a few blocks away from me, so we started walking together. My apartment is about a 15-minute walk from that bar if you take the main road. It's well lit most of the way, and there are usually cars around. That night was colder than it looked. Veronica and I walked and talked, still in that post-bar mood, recapping stupid stuff from the night and laughing at things that weren't that funny. We got to the point where our routes split. She had to turn off onto a quieter street to cut through to her place. I stayed on the main road for another 3 blocks before cutting over to my street. She stopped at the corner. I gave her a nod, she smiled, and walked away. I watched her for a second, just to make sure she got onto her street okay. Then I turned and kept going. The street I was on had businesses that were all closed. I was walking past a closed pharmacy when I noticed someone across the street. At first, it was just a shape moving under a streetlight. As I took a closer look, I saw a person in dark clothes. I didn't think much of it, but the way they moved made me slow down without even deciding to. It was like their joints weren't doing what they're supposed to do, like their shoulders were too loose, their arms weren't swinging normally, their steps weren't even. Very creepy stuff. One foot would land normal and the other would sort of drag, but not like an injury. The thing that made my stomach tighten was that it didn't look accidental. It looked intentional. Like they were trying to walk in the creepiest possible way. They crossed under another streetlight, and I got a clearer look. It was a guy, tall, hood up, hands hanging low. His head tilted slightly, like he was staring at the ground in front of him. But every couple steps his head would jerk up, like he was checking if someone was watching. I stopped for a half second, pretending I was just adjusting my bag. I wanted to see if he kept going, or if he was just some drunk guy walking home. But I noticed that when I paused, he paused too. That's the first moment my brain stopped trying to be chill about it. I started walking again, eyes forward, trying not to look obvious. I pulled my phone out like I was checking it, but really, I was watching him in my peripheral. He started moving again at the exact same time. He then did something that made my skin go tight. He lifted one arm, slowly, like he was feeling for strings, pretending his arm was being pulled by something invisible. Then he let it drop. He kept walking, but the weirdness was amping up, like he was building to something. His shoulders rolled in this unnatural way. He'd take a step and then pause mid-step, like he was balancing on one foot longer than normal, like a puppet trying to act human. At this point, I didn't care if I looked paranoid. I turned my head and looked straight at him. He stopped dead, For a second, we just stared at each other across the street. I couldn't see his face. The hood shadowed it, and the streetlight behind him didn't help. But I could see enough to know he was looking right at me. Then he did this slow, exaggerated lean forward, and his head tilted farther than a head should tilt without being uncomfortable. It was like he knew I was scared, and he was taunting me. My heart started pounding so fast, so I kept walking. I didn't speed up too much because I didn't know what to do. I know that sounds stupid, but if you've ever been in that situation, you get it. You're trying to stay calm because you don't want to turn it into a chase. The second I took 2 quicker steps, he took 2 quicker steps too. Still across the street, but now he was keeping pace with me, matching me like we were walking together. And then he started doing something else. Every few steps, he'd kind of hop sideways, like his legs were malfunctioning. And every time he did it, he would smile, like he was checking for my reaction. I couldn't hear him at first because the street was empty. Then I did. It sounded like quiet laughing. Not normal laughter either. It was this low, breathy chuckle that sounded like someone trying not to laugh out loud. I slowed down and drifted closer to the curb, like I might cross at the next intersection. But he stopped too, and the laughing stopped as well. That's when I realized I hadn't seen a single person in a while. No cars either, just the hum of streetlights and distant traffic. I had 3 blocks before my turnoff. My street is quieter, less lighting, mostly apartments and a couple small houses. If I turned there with him still near me, I'd be boxed into a darker street. So I decided I wasn't going home yet. I wanted to lose him first. I kept walking straight past where I normally would have turned. As soon as I did, his weird walk paused for a second, then started again, but faster. He crossed the street fast, like he didn't care about cars because there weren't any. Now he was on my side of the road. When he got to the sidewalk, he went back to the creepy walk immediately. Shoulders loose, arms hanging, feet landing wrong. Except now he was closer. Close enough that I could hear his shoes scuffing the pavement. I know that if I turned my head fully, I'd see his face. I pulled my phone up and pretended to call someone. I didn't even unlock it right away because my hands were shaking. I eventually called Veronica. I heard the guy behind me make a sound, like he was annoyed. Veronica answered, half asleep. "Hello?" I whispered. "Hey, don't hang up. There's a guy behind me acting weird and following me." Her voice snapped awake instantly. "Where are you?" I told her the street name and that I was heading toward the 24-hour gas station a few blocks up. "Turn your camera on," she said. I did. My screen lit up and showed my face. I looked so pale and scared. I angled the camera slightly so she could see behind me. She goes, "Oh my God." Seeing him on the screen made it even worse. He kept doing that head jerk thing. He'd tilt his head sideways like he was listening for something, then snap it back. Then he'd take a long step and freeze mid-stride. Veronica asked, "Is he doing that on purpose?" "Yes," I whispered. "He's been matching me." "Go in somewhere right now," she yelled. The nearest somewhere was the 24-hour gas station up ahead. I kept walking straight towards it. The guy behind me suddenly sped up. His creepy walk turned into a faster creepy walk, like he wanted to close the distance between us. He started speaking. At first it was too low to understand, like mumbling. Then I caught a few words. "Not going home?" My stomach flipped. He was close enough now that his voice was right behind my shoulder. I did not look back. I kept my eyes on the gas station like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Veronica was saying, "Don't talk to him, just get inside. I'm calling the police." The guy laughed again, and then he said, "You saw me, so I had to make it fun." Like he was talking to a friend. He wanted a reaction like this was entertainment. The gas station doors were right there. I stepped into the light and felt the tiniest bit of relief. There were two cars at the pumps, a guy standing near one of them. Inside, I could see an employee behind the counter. I walked straight in. I went right to the counter and said, "There's a guy following me." The employee looked up. He was older, tired, like he'd seen everything. He glanced past me through the glass. The creepy guy stopped outside the door. He stood just under the light. He then started doing the weird walk again, but now it was exaggerated, almost like he was performing for the employee too. The employee's face tightened. He reached under the counter and grabbed something. "You want me to call someone?" he asked. "My friend's calling the police," I said, still holding the phone. Veronica was on FaceTime, her face tense. "Tell him he's on camera," she said. "Tell him the cops are coming." The employee lifted his chin at the guy outside and asked through the glass, "Hey, you good?" The guy stared at him. I could finally see his face better. Not fully, but enough. He was smiling. Not a normal smile. It was too wide, like he practiced it. He raised one hand and slowly tapped the glass with his knuckle. He leaned close to the window and looked right at me. He licked the window and moved his mouth like he was saying something, but I couldn't hear through the glass. Then he turned his head and looked at the security camera above the door, and he smiled up at it too, like he was acknowledging it. I stepped back and closed my eyes. He eventually stepped out of view into the darker part near the side of the building. The employee cursed under his breath. "You stay in here," he said. "Don't go back out." I nodded. I was shaking so hard I couldn't stop. I felt sick. I kept expecting the guy to come back into view. The employee came around the counter and locked the door, even though it was a 24-hour place. He flipped the sign to say, "Closed." "That dude ain't right," he said. Veronica stayed on the call the whole time. She said she'd given the dispatcher the address. She kept asking if I could see him, but I couldn't. That was almost worse. A car eventually pulled into the lot. For a split second, I panicked, thinking it was him. But it was a police car. Relief hit me so hard my legs felt weak. Two officers came in after the employee unlocked the door. I told them everything, how he was across the street, how he matched me, how he crossed over, how he talked. The officer asked, "Did he touch you?" "No." "Did he threaten you?" "Not exactly." "Did he show a weapon?" "No." I could see the familiar pattern forming on their faces. The "we can't do much" face. But then Veronica said something through my phone, and I repeated it out loud. He said, "You saw me, so I had to make it fun." That made the officer's expression change slightly, because it sounded less like a random encounter and more like a person who does this to scare others. They walked outside. They looked around the building with flashlights. They checked the side alley. Nothing. One officer came back and asked me, "Which direction did he come from?" I pointed. The employee said, "He went around the side. That's where the dumpsters are. He could have cut through." The police nodded. They said they'd patrol the area. Then one officer offered to drive me home. I said yes immediately. There was no way I was walking home. In the back seat, I kept looking out the window, like I expected the guy to pop up from behind a parked car. and do that weird walk across the headlights. We got to my apartment, and the officer waited while I unlocked my door and went inside. He told me to call if I saw the guy again. I locked everything and stood in my hallway with my back against the door, breathing like I'd just run. Veronica stayed on FaceTime until I calmed down. After we hung up, I went to my bedroom window and peeked through the curtain just a little. The street outside looked normal, empty, quiet, calm. Then I saw something under the streetlight down the block. A figure standing still and facing my building. I froze. My whole body went cold again. The figure lifted an arm slowly and waved, like they were waving at someone they knew. I dropped the curtain and backed away from the window so fast I hit my dresser. I didn't look again. I didn't want to accept it. I slept on my couch that night with the lights and TV on. The next day, I told myself maybe it was a bad dream. Maybe I was just scared, and my brain filled in the blanks. But later that week, I went to the same bar with my friends again, and before we even ordered our drinks, one of the bartenders said, "Hey, are you okay?" I asked. "Why?" He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't want to be involved, but he also didn't want to ignore it. He told me he heard about what happened. That's when I confirmed it wasn't a bad dream. It wasn't a monster. It was real. It was someone who figured out that acting wrong, moving wrong, and smiling wrong was enough to make someone feel scared. And the creepiest part is that it worked. I don't walk home from bars or at night anymore. I don't care if it's 5 minutes. I don't care if the street is busy. If I can't get a ride, I don't go. And occasionally, when I'm out late and I pass someone on the sidewalk who moves a little strange or a little off, I feel my body tense, like it's remembering that night. I grew up in a suburb just outside of Mexico City. It's the kind of place where gated communities are surrounded by older, dustier neighborhoods. If you live there, you know the vibe. High concrete walls topped with broken glass or rusted barbed wire, and the constant, distant sound of barking dogs that never seemed to sleep. It was a Saturday night, maybe 2 in the morning. My friend and I had been at a small gathering at a house a few miles away. We were 19, broke, and the last bus had stopped running hours ago. We didn't have money for a cab, so we decided to walk. It was a straight shot down a long 2-lane road that cut through some empty, overgrown lots before hitting our neighborhood. We were halfway through one of those empty stretches when I first noticed the truck. It was a white Ford truck, the kind with the double cab and tinted windows that look like black glass. It wasn't speeding. It was crawling along the shoulder of the road about 100 yards behind us. "Don't look back," I whispered to Dylan. "I already saw it, dude," he muttered, his voice dropping an octave. We kept our pace steady, trying to act like we were just two guys having a casual conversation, but my heart was starting to hammer against my ribs. In Mexico, a white truck moving that slowly at 1 a.m. isn't just a car. The truck eventually pulled up alongside us. It stayed about 10 feet to our left, matching our walking speed perfectly. The engine had this low, expensive rumble that made the air feel heavy. The windows stayed up. We couldn't see the driver, couldn't see if there were 4 people in there or just one. "Hey," Dylan said, his voice shaking slightly as he looked toward the driver's side. "Everything okay?" The truck didn't stop. It just kept rolling. Then, the passenger side window slid down about 2 inches, just enough for a sliver of darkness to show. A hand reached out, a pale hand with a heavy silver ring on the middle finger. It wasn't holding a weapon, it was holding a crumpled up bag of chips. The hand flipped the bag over, letting the crumbs fall onto the asphalt, and then let the bag fly away into the wind. The window slid back up. The truck suddenly floored it. The tires shrieked, and the truck disappeared into the darkness ahead of us, the red taillights fading until they were just two red glowing dots. Dylan let out a huge breath. Idiots, just trying to freak us out. Let's just get home, man, I said. I wanted to believe him, but the way that hand had dropped the trash, it felt too deliberate, like someone marking a spot. We reached the edge of our neighborhood about 10 minutes later. To get to our street, we had to take a shortcut through an alleyway squeezed between two high warehouse walls. It was dark, but it saved us 15 minutes of walking. We were halfway through the alley when we heard the rumble again. I looked back. At the entrance of the alley, the white truck had pulled across the opening, blocking it completely. The headlights were off, but the engine was idling. "Run," I said. We sprinted. The exit of the alley opened up into a small plaza with a closed-up OXXO and a few parked cars. We burst out into the open air, gasping, and dove behind a row of concrete planters. We waited. 10 seconds. 30. A minute. The truck didn't follow us into the market. It just stayed at the mouth of the alley. Then, we heard a whistle. It wasn't a loud, shrill whistle. It was a low, two-note whistle. It sounded like someone calling a dog. A man stepped out from around the corner of the OXXO, maybe 20 feet away from where we were crouching. He wasn't from the truck. He had been waiting there. He was wearing a simple denim jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He didn't look at us. He looked toward the alley and whistled back, the same two notes. Then he turned his head and looked directly at the planter where we were hiding. "They're behind the concrete," he said. He didn't yell it. He just said it, like he was giving a status report. Dylan and I didn't wait. We scrambled up and ran toward the residential streets. We knew these back alleys better than anyone. We jumped a low chain-link fence, sprinted through a neighbor's yard, and scrambled over a back wall into Dylan's patio. We burst through his back door and slammed the bolt home. Dylan's dad was asleep on the couch with the TV on, but he didn't wake up. We stood in the dark kitchen, chests heaving, staring out the small window that faced the street. The street was empty. No white truck. No man in a denim jacket. "They're gone," Dylan whispered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We lost them in the yards." I wanted to agree. I really did. I stayed at his house that night. We didn't sleep. We sat on the floor of his room, listening to every car that passed, every dog that barked. By 6 a.m., the sun started to bleed over the horizon, and the neighborhood started to wake up. People were heading to the bus stops. The Panadero was honking his horn down the street. I felt safe enough to head home. My house was only 3 blocks away. I hugged Dylan, joked about how we were a bunch of cowards, and walked out the front door. I walked down the sidewalk, the morning air feeling cool and normal. I reached my front gate, pulled out my keys, and started to unlock the padlock. Something caught my eye on the top of the gate's pillar. It was a small, silver ring. It was sitting right on the edge of the concrete, perfectly centered. I looked down at the street. Parked about 3 houses down was a white Ford truck. It was empty. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, just enough to show the interior light was on. I didn't go inside my house. I realized then that they hadn't been following us to catch us in the alley. They had been following us to see where we lived. They knew which house was Dylan's, and they had followed me to see which one was mine. The man in the denim jacket wasn't a lookout for the truck. The truck was the distraction for the man on the ground. I turned around and walked back to Dylan's. I didn't run this time. I walked fast, my eyes scanning every window, every doorway. When I got back to his gate, I saw him standing out front, looking at the ground. "Dylan?" I called out. He looked up, and his face was white. He held up his hand. In his palm was a small, crumpled-up bag of chips. He'd found it tucked into the handle of his front door. We didn't call the police. In that part of Mexico City, you don't call the police for a gift. We just stopped walking at night. Both of our families moved out of that neighborhood within a few months. I still have that silver ring. I kept it to remind myself that the scariest thing isn't the person who chases you. It's the person who waits for you to show them exactly where you sleep. I work as a site inspector for a large construction firm, which basically means I spend half my life driving to remote areas of the state to check on progress. Last October, I was heading home from a job site about 3 hours north of my city. It was one of those nights where the fog is so thick, it feels like you're driving through a bowl of milk, and the GPS keeps losing signal because you're surrounded by nothing but pine trees and old farmland. Around 1 a.m., I realized I was dangerously low on gas. I finally saw a sign for a 24-hour station, one of those decrepit, single-pump places that looks like it hasn't been painted since the Korean War. I pulled in, and that's when I saw him. He was sitting on a plastic crate right next to the air compressor. He was dressed in a full clown suit, but it wasn't the bright, baggy kind. It was form-fitting, dirty white spandex with faded blue pom-poms down the chest. He had the full face paint, the high-arched eyebrows, and the wide, red, permanent grin. But he was just sitting there, perfectly still, staring at the ground. I kept my head down, swiped my card at the pump, and started filling up. I didn't want to make eye contact. You see a clown at a gas station in the middle of nowhere at 1 a.m., you just get your gas and go. The pump clicked. Full tank. As I reached for the nozzle to put it back, I heard a sound. A soft, wet, squeaking noise. I looked over. The clown was standing now. He was holding a long, uninflated yellow balloon. He began to blow it up, his cheeks puffing out, his eyes fixed directly on mine. He didn't blink. He tied it off with a quick, practiced snap of his fingers and started twisting. In about 10 seconds, he'd made a dog. He held it out toward me, his arm fully extended. He didn't say a word. He just stood there with that painted-on smile, offering me a balloon dog in the freezing fog. "I'm good, thanks," I muttered. I hopped into my car and locked the doors immediately. I pulled out of the station and hit the road, pushing the speed limit just to get some distance. About 5 miles down the road, I checked my rearview mirror. The fog had thinned out a little, and I could see 2 headlights behind me. They were far back, so I didn't think much of it. 10 miles later, the headlights were closer, much closer. I sped up to 70. They sped up. I slowed down, hoping they'd just pass me on the left. They slowed down too, hovering exactly 20 feet behind my bumper. My heart started to do that heavy, rhythmic thrumming in my chest. I reached for my phone to call someone, but I still had no service. I looked in the mirror again, squinting to see the car behind me. It was an old, rusted-out white van. Suddenly, the van's high beams flicked on. The light flooded my cabin, reflecting off my mirrors and blinding me for a second. I blocked the glare with my hand, and that's when I saw the silhouette through the van's windshield. It was him. The clown was driving. He was leaning forward, his face almost pressed against the glass, that white and red face paint illuminated by his own dashboard lights. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He was just staring. I floored it. My car is a decent V6, and I managed to pull away, putting maybe a quarter mile between us. I was panicking, looking for a turnoff, a house, anything with a light on. I saw a narrow dirt road to the right and took it at 40 miles an hour, my tires fishtailing in the gravel. I drove about a mile in, turned off my headlights, killed the engine, and waited. The van roared past the entrance to the dirt road a few seconds later, continuing down the main highway. I sat there in the pitch black for 20 minutes. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the steering wheel. I waited until I was sure he was gone. Then I slowly backed out and headed the opposite direction, taking a long, winding detour through 2 different towns just to be safe. I finally got home around 4 a.m. I parked in my driveway, ran inside, locked every door, and checked the windows. I felt like an idiot, but the image of that painted face in the high beams was burned into my retinas. Eventually, I managed to pass out on the couch. The next morning, I walked out to my car to head to the office. I stopped dead in the middle of my driveway. Pinned under my windshield wiper was a yellow balloon dog. It had deflated slightly in the night air, looking shriveled and wrinkled. I looked down at the gravel by my front tire. There were several deep, heavy footprints in the mud, the kind made by oversized, flat-soled shoes. I didn't call the police. What was I going to say? A clown followed me home and gave me a balloon? But as I got into the car, I noticed something else. On the driver's side window, right at eye level, there was a faint, greasy smudge on the glass. It was the perfect outline of a nose and a wide, grinning mouth, where someone had pressed their face against the window to watch me while I was sitting inside. I went back into the house and spent the afternoon installing a deadbolt on my bedroom door. I haven't seen the van since, but every time I hear the wind whistle through the eaves of the house, it sounds exactly like the squeak of a balloon being twisted. I don't go to that gas station anymore. I don't even like driving at night. I just keep thinking about how long he must have stood there in my driveway, in total silence, just watching me breathe through the glass. When I moved from Ireland to the UK for my bachelor's degree, the biggest shock wasn't the coursework or the city itself. It was the housing. The student rental market is a brutal machine, and landlords squeeze every possible penny out of their properties. I ended up in a classic British terraced house. If you haven't seen one, it's basically a long row of brick houses pushed tight together, and the front walls drop directly onto the public sidewalk. There is no front yard, no porch, just a thin strip of concrete, a step, and the street. To maximize rent, my landlord had converted the downstairs living room into an extra bedroom. That was my room for the first year. It was an incredibly bizarre way to live. My bed was pushed up against the front wall, which meant my head was maybe 3 feet away from the people walking by outside. The front door of the house was right outside my bedroom door. In the beginning, it drove me crazy. I could hear every conversation, every barking dog, every group of drunk students stumbling home from the pub. But after a few months, my brain adapted. I learned to tune out the background noise. More importantly, I learned the specific audio difference between footsteps walking past my window and footsteps stopping, turning, and stepping up onto our welcome mat. In mid-February, both of my housemates went back to their hometowns for the weekend. I think it was around Valentine's Day, and they wanted to see their families or boyfriends. Being an international student, a quick trip back to Ireland wasn't in my budget. I had the whole house to myself. It was a Friday night, somewhere around 11:45 p.m. I was lying in bed, fully awake, with my overhead bedroom light blazing. I was on a call with my long-distance boyfriend, just talking on speakerphone while I scrolled through my laptop. Then I heard it, the crunch of a shoe on the small patch of gravel right outside. The footsteps didn't fade down the pavement. They stopped. I stopped mid-sentence and muted my phone. I laid there perfectly still, listening. 10 seconds passed. Then I heard the heavy, metallic clunk of the front door handle being pressed down. Someone was putting their weight onto it, testing the lock. "Hold on a second," I whispered to my boyfriend. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp through the speaker. "Someone's messing with the front door." I slipped out of bed. My bare feet barely made a sound on the cheap laminate floor. I walked over to the front window. The streetlights in our neighborhood turned off after a certain hour to save the city council money, so it was completely pitch black out there. Because my bedroom light was so bright, my window was acting like a giant, flat mirror. The curtains were drawn, just cheap, thin fabric, but there was a gap in the middle. I wanted to see who was out there. I figured it was just a drunk student who had the wrong house. I pulled the curtain back a couple of inches. All I could see in the glass was the reflection of my own face and the yellow bulb on my ceiling. If you want to look out of a lit room into the dark, you have to block out the glare. I stepped right up to the sill. I leaned forward, pressed my forehead directly against the freezing cold pane of glass, and cupped both of my hands firmly around the sides of my eyes to create a dark tunnel. It took a second for my eyes to adjust to the heavy darkness outside. When they did, I realized I wasn't looking at an empty street. There was a man standing in the narrow gap between the sidewalk and my house. He was wearing a dark, heavy hoodie, the hood pulled up tight over his head. And he was doing the exact same thing I was. His forehead was pressed hard against the outside of the glass. His hands were cupped around his eyes, shielding them from the street. We were staring directly at each other, our pupils fully dilated, separated by maybe a quarter-inch of cheap window pane. All the air rushed out of my lungs. I didn't scream. My throat physically closed up. It felt like someone had dumped a bucket of crushed ice down the back of my neck. My entire body locked into a rigid paralysis. He hadn't been testing the door to see if it was unlocked. He had tested the door, saw my bedroom light shining through the gaps in the curtains, and walked over to see who was inside. For a fraction of a second, he just stared back at me. I couldn't make out any features other than the wide, white rings of his eyes in the shadow of the hood. Then, he realized I was looking right back at him. He dropped his hands, took a fast step backward, and bolted. I heard the heavy thud of his boots hitting the pavement, sprinting away down the street until the sound disappeared into the neighborhood. My legs gave out. I stumbled back from the window and hit the edge of my bed. I grabbed my phone, unmuted it, and told my boyfriend to call the local police. 2 officers arrived about 20 minutes later. They knocked on the front door, and I practically dragged them inside. One of them stayed with me while the other walked around the block with a flashlight. He came back 10 minutes later, shaking his head. The street was empty. They told me to keep the doors locked and left. I spent the rest of that weekend entirely confined to the living room area. I dragged my duvet onto the sofa and kept every single light in the house turned on. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I just saw that dark shape pressed against the glass. I kept my laptop open, playing bright, loud comedy movies back to back, just to fill the silence, sitting awake until the sun finally came up and the street started filling with normal morning traffic. I live in a third-floor apartment now. Whenever I move into a new place, the first thing I do is install heavy blackout curtains.
If you like these stories and want to see more, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this video. It helps us a lot. If you would like to submit your story, check the email in the description. Thank you for watching.